Okay, I think I'm recording. Okay. Well, let's make a start. Welcome. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining. I know that in the past, well, not Chris's presentation, but a lot of the presentations in the past were just recorded and shared. And I appreciate that that doesn't really make up in any shape or form for the situation and the space and the sounds that are possible in the lecture theatre. Today and next week, which indeed will be the last one in the series of Introduction to Design Studies, I wanted to propose that we do a real-time Zoom lecture or Zoom seminar. Today, the rationale behind it is that I want the other tutors to have a voice, because it is very much about, as you know from the syllabus, it's about gendered objects. And I felt particularly misplaced to present something on my own about gendered objects, and by default or design, present one particular perspective. So I've invited the other tutors today to join me, and so we'll have different voices. And indeed, we have one alumni, one of the course, a student who took the Introduction to Design Studies last year. Is that correct, Jan? Or last term? Yep, last term, and she'll present a bit as well. So this is the idea that gender, as much as race, in PJ's presentation earlier in the term, stands in for wider perspectives on design discourses, design studies. And it doesn't mean that, of course, they have a very particular value, these discussions in themselves. But of course, just talking about race and just talking about gender, with all the baggage that comes with that, you know, especially in gender, about binaries and lack of ambiguity and lack of ambivalence, and the dichotomy between two genders as it is canonically in a heteronormative society presented. All of these are shortcomings, and we'll discuss some of them with you, but the caveat in a way is to say, well, they are representative for possible alternative views of the way in which we're presenting it. And by alternative, I don't mean marginal or not as important, but alternative to the way that I've been presenting things, because as you know from the curriculum, it's a subjective suggestion to say, okay, this is one topic, this is another, and so on and so forth. So this, in a small way, is an indication of how much you could actually open it up if we had a different format. If we weren't relying on one particular instructor to give lectures, and then we had guests and other contributors, but it is this idea that you have a lead instructor, which is quite complicated in itself, but that's how it's set up. And of course that, as you have experienced, means that there is a certain direction, a certain perspective given. And today I want to widen this a bit. So the research questions, if that's the right way to put it, for this afternoon are, and they're not exhaustive, you know, they're more than that. How are designs, and by designs, as usual, we mean objects, systems, services, other things that touch on the idea of the design world, where it's not just about commodities being produced or products being made, but a wider definition of what design can achieve. How are designs gendered? How are they, in a way, particularized by certain things? How are they gendered or informed, marked, determined by their makers? The gender of their makers, the sexuality of their makers. How can they be gendered or put into gender categories by the material attributes, through their material attributes? For example, soft, hard, matte, glossy, dry, wet, flexible, pliable, static, dynamic. Do these words in the English language, which also is a single perspective, we're going to talk about this in later in the presentation. Do these words in English already suggest certain attributes that speak of traditional gender categories, or can they be used to subvert those? Are designed objects, services, or systems gendered by their coloration? And is this coloration, the colors that I use, the hues, the idea of monochromatic or multicolored, are these in themselves almost atavistic genetic reactions that viewers have, or are these categorizations of designs by color, are these things that are learned through cultural traditions, through historical systems, and so on and so forth? Talking about language, are the names that are used in diverse languages for designs, do they categorize and maybe gender the product? What about the way in which designs are communicated? Do they categorize the designs? Are they targeted for particular consumer groups, which a lot of designs are if they move into the realm of the commodity? And are these consumer groups determined by things like gender or sexuality? Very obviously. And is the cultural history implicitly what we've been doing, although this is not introduction to design history, but introduction to design studies, but is the history of design also contributing this idea of gendering particular designs? So these are the few questions, not all of them, but these are the few that I would propose we could address and discuss. But because the larger context, the larger structure for all the presentations within Introduction to Design Studies was this move from making to telling to showing. I wanted once more to go back to this relationship between the making and the showing, or the making, the telling, and the showing. Is there something between the process of producing a design and the way it is presented, not necessarily with the complete accord of all the people who have been producing it in the first place? Is this difference between making something and then showing it, does that also allow for particular spaces where a gendering of object systems, of services can occur? So is the idea of gender categories also dependent on whether we're talking about making or telling or showing? Let me give you an example, because I've been talking about research questions. Here's the idea of a research question. So this is and I have the links, I'll put this on Canvas and you have the links at the bottom so you can look up these examples. So here's a research question that was put out by the United Nations to design companies and non-governmental organizations that were designing systems and services. And the question that the United Nations asked was, how might we radically improve access to and quality of sexual and reproductive health education and services for young people? So the way this is phrased in English, and I'm sure they put out this message in many different languages, being the UN, it seems neutral. It's not gendering the question. It talks about young people, and it talks about sexual and reproductive health. But there is, in the combination between the images and the words, already a certain direction given by the way in which this open call for projects was made public in the first place. And they, on their website, they talk about, or they give an indication of how the process of selecting these designs that seem to approach or answer this research question proceeded. So you have on the left, you have the initial phase, and then there's a timeline going to the right, and you have research. 278 contributors took this research question on and thought about it. 254 came up with ideas. Out of this, 55 were invited to refine their ideas, and then the top ideas were announced. And the top ideas were the top 5 were grouped in this website. And then there was a press release, as you can see here. The UNFPA is a subgroup of the United Nations. It's the United Nations Population Fund. So this is the UN Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency. This is what they are specifically tasked with researching, solving, contributing to. And in the press release, you can see that they talk about the idea of the challenge that they issued, the way in which it was responded to. But then you can see that they already, from the more neutral research presentation or research question, they go into something that is much more definite about a particular gender. Namely, in the second paragraph, it talks hundreds of challenge participants who recognize the current solution for women and girls are insufficient. So the research question gets very much targeted. And I don't mean this in any negative way, but it's clear that either through the refinement of the research question or the type of contributions, research suggestions that the UNFPA received from their open call, the task was made a bit more precise in terms of gender. So not so much about sexuality, but clearly about gender, and about one gender in particular. And so then they have a part of their website, they have the 5 top research contributions and projects. And I picked one that actually has not only, as you can see here, it's called B-Girl, is not simply something that was done as a research project with the collaboration of the United Nations, but actually became a commercial proposition. So it has a website. So apart from being something that charities and non-governmental organizations can team up with and distribute in different parts of the world. Here, I think this is a photo from, did say Mozambique, I think this is. And here you have, they're based in the US, you have a more, I won't say first world, first world, developing world and so on, those categories are defunct and should not be used anyway, but there is a particular form of presentation here that obviously moves away from the idea that this is about a development fund or a development project from the UN, but this is clearly a commercial proposition. So this is how the initial research proposition gets refined, and the designed object becomes gendered in a entirely positive way. Again, I want to stress that this is not about a presentation where I'm saying it's limiting the perspective on what this project contains. It just shows that for very good reasons, a gendered focus was applied. So here, the idea of a gendered design is clearly something extremely productive, that came out of the research question. The research question, although formulated neutrally, was taken by most of the applicants as something that needed to be targeted by gender in order to address inequalities, in order to address clear lack in facilities and products for particular gender. So from that nice pinkness that you see in a lot of these, or slightly fuchsia color maybe, I wanted to proceed to another fuchsia color, staying within the same color scheme, but now coming to something completely different. And in a moment, I'll invite Chen and Shilaim, his student, to talk a bit about this. But just as an introduction, if I may, a few slides. So here's something in pink, which I'm sure a lot of you recognize. A Comfort Glide white tea razor, so a commodity that is designed, you know, not just the packaging, but also the product itself. And I just looked it up last week, and it retails in the US for $23. So you get the razor and you get 3 blades. Now, the same company, Gillette, also makes razors for men. And here you get a razor, different color scheme, also with 3 blades, and it is $17. And it's exactly the same technology, you know? Of course, Gillette, as you might know, has a wide range of razors, but these two can be very closely compared because of the lubrication strips, the way the technology works, the clip-on and so on. Yet there is a difference of $6 between them. And maybe this is a moot question, but we'll approach it nonetheless. Why is that? Why would there be a bit different in price? And so in order to tell us a bit about why this might be and what one could do in order to rectify this as a designer, but also as a consumer, can I invite Chen and his student maybe to take over and share their slides?
Of course. I will start with a short intro to Sheila's presentation, and she will take over and continue. So, as a means of introduction, this pink tax is a term that is being used lately a lot, and it aims to cover different kind of problems all together within the same scheme. So, in my last 3 years of teaching experience for this class, I received a lot of finals and student projects, and most of them actually address this topic and the difference of price that we pay for male products versus female products. And last semester, I had a chance to receive a presentation, which was more like an overall assessment of the gendered objects and how it's used in the marketing strategies. So I will give you a short intro, a few slides. And Sheila, are you there?
Hi, yes, I am. I actually pre-recorded a short presentation, which I can get done in 4 minutes, if that's okay.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Alrighty, if you give me 1 moment.
Sure. I will start with your intro a bit, just to mention the topic, and then you can continue right after. Are you ready?
Yes. Should I play?
No, in a minute. So basically, what Sheila did was a good visualization of big data. And by big data, I mean there are different products that we can use as an example. The example we used is Gillette, but when you think about personal daycare or hygiene products, this is a huge list. So it's hard to assess sometimes the gravity of the problem. So Sheila will continue on this with some figures and arguments.
Hi everybody, my name is Shaylem Horta, and today I'll be presenting the pink tax, just another form of gender inequality. So you may ask yourself, what is a pink tax? This refers to extra charges placed on products and services directed towards women. The pink tax not only fuels gender inequality, but brings up controversy like wage gaps and discrimination. This brings up the question of when will women stop falling for these marketing tactics. In this graph, you see that women spend 7% more on products such as clothing and personal care items when they have the same utility and same function as their male counterparts. As shown in these case studies, where you see a clear distinction on prices, making women spend an extra $1,351 every year for items that have the same utility. In this graph, I'm trying to paint the picture of how women are treated internationally, and you see that it's the same thing going on in the fragrance market, where women are expected to pay more for items that pretty much do the same things and shouldn't really have a gender or pay discrimination. In this graph, pink tax versus blue tax, I'm trying to reiterate and show the same ripple effect of women paying for more for the same products as men. When women earn less and pay more, and sometimes even have it harder to make ends meet because they have to spend and rebudget a lot more than men do, since their items cost a little bit more just because of the pink packaging or the fact that they're just marketed towards the female gender. In this graph, I'm trying to show how in the United States, each state has their like percentage of gender gap pay, and you really see which states, the states that are like the most red are the ones that have the biggest gap in that equality, and really shows how there's still a lot of work to do in the US, and closing the gap is just, it's a race that women are making slowly, and progress that's been made a little bit slower than for men. In this graph, I'm also showing the price parity, showing that by the year 2025, there could be an additional 2.1 trillion in GDP if women are able to reach the same pay that men get, showing just like how much more money this nation could have and make if women were on the same plane, making the same had the same financial stability as men did, which leads to discrimination from a very early age, as shown in graph 1, that this gets impacted from all levels of high school and college, and can even go as much as, gender inequality and discrimination of race. And then the next graph shows how if we continue to raise the pay gap where women make less than men, we'll just always be unequal. So I leave you with hashtag fight the pink tax so that we are able to live in a more equal world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shilan. Can we, the nice clapping, of course. Thank you very much. Did you, because the presentation was, as I understand it from last term, did you discuss any further what designers, people who are tasked with developing new structures, new systems, new services, or indeed new objects and commodities, what they could consider as possible avenues of solutions towards this inequality?
What I've seen so far in the market has been more of like de-branding of female products. I didn't really follow up on the designers because a lot of these, when I was studying this topic, a lot of the marketing tactics were coming in my research from men. So, now that you see a lot of other brands like, bringing out more products that are more gender neutral, you really start to see this distinction and how there's a really big changing mindset towards, why does my razor have to be pink? When it's just a razor and we use it based on our function, not on the color that it has, and why should we be charged more? So I have been seeing a lot of, let's say on the subway when we would be able to go, you see a lot of ads selling hers and hims. That's a brand that comes to mind, that are trying to make things a little bit more gender neutral for everybody, so that everybody has the same access and that there isn't this gap.
Ulrich, I have a short question. We always discuss the consumer side, so there are a lot of examples, and I hope this pink tax movement is going to work. But do we see any kind of changes in the way women are paid in our design jobs, like any kind of design office? Is it like the pay gap is also relevant for basically design industry too?
Well, this is, I wanted to approach this in another slide, but maybe we don't actually need a slide in order to start the discussion about this. There are two avenues that are tried out as I can see it in the US. California was the first one who instated a law, i.e. from up top, from a legal administrative standpoint, to say you cannot, if it's the same product with the same material specs, you cannot sell one for a higher price than the other just based on gender. Now, this is a very difficult legal precedent to invoke, and of course it's been challenged, you know, but California went the way in saying we need to do this from up top. We cannot rely on the producers or the distributors, and we cannot find a way of activating consumers, because this is asking a lot, you know, to say it's consumers' choice, and consumers' choice will change the market. So California went away and saying, okay, we go from the top. We say it's illegal to do that. Most of the other states, and I think New York, as far as I know, is going that way as well. But of course, these things are challenged. But because, as you, Shelam, and also you made very, very clear, there is actually money being made from the pockets of the female population, or those who identify with these pink products and want to purchase them. And so the impetus for a producer might not be there, because they might go, hold on, why should I charge the same price when I can charge women more, you know? So the idea of allowing the producer to self-regulate, or indeed, as it's so often in free market systems, to put the onus on the consumer and say, oh, if you guys were just activist consumers and would vote with your pockets or your feet and say, oh, we are not consuming this because this is ripping us off. That is an approach that's often enacted by lawmakers in this country, saying, oh, listen, it's a free market. If this doesn't work, if this is something that people don't like, they won't buy it. But of course, as we all know, it's not so easy, because people are swayed through media, through communication techniques, which is also part of the design culture. And it's very difficult for a consumer to be informed enough and to be independent, if that's the right word, or be strong enough to withstand this onslaught of gender-based codification from a very early age, maybe ingrained in you as a toddler. And to resist this and say, I want to become a conscious consumer and refuse this pink tax, that's a very, very hard thing for most women to do. So there is, on the one hand, this idea, oh, the market will regulate itself. So if enough enlightened designers and enlightened manufacturers club together, we will have a better world. That's the one side. And the other side is then passing a law from the state or from a nation saying it is illegal to charge for the same jeans for a 501 $10 more. You cannot do this, you know. But where the overall effect is recognizable from my research, limited as it is only when there is a legal impetus, when manufacturers have to abide a law that is set. The idea that manufacturers self-regulate or that consumers do it seems not to work. But I'm opening this up. I mean, what is your experience, all the others? Do you think, where do you think the how should we put it, the intervention should come from in order to solve or to start approaching a solution to this problem?
I'll go first. When we discussed this issue with other students, it was always like it came to the chicken and egg problem. So we designed some gendered objects which give some specific idea of gender for our society and individuals, and those people become designers and they design gendered products, etc., etc. So it's like there's a chicken and egg problem, but we also discussed that especially for our generation, this generation, it is changing quite rapidly. And this is thanks to the internet, thanks to some social movements. So I agree that civic part is very important, but I don't think it's possible to enforce, especially producers, to follow some guidelines unless there is a governmental action. And this is a very constitutional need. This is not a big law that is required. If you cannot discriminate based on gender, this is not only for people, but that should be also based on products. And I understand some companies can get away with it, saying that the difference is not gender, it's market. It's not what we decided, but it's what more consumers have decided. Well, in that respect, my problem is in general with consumer market is the same. When I go to a specific shop, I see 5 different types of hair products and they all seem different, but they're from the same company. So if I don't get a chance to choose fairly, then the market logic doesn't work. It doesn't apply here. And if the market logic can't work that way, I think governmental action is definitely necessary.
Do other people have an idea of where one, as somebody working in design and working towards a professional career, in having to address these points, where one could intervene and start making a change? Maybe we can approach the question at the end again and see where you see the role of the designers. As I said, the maker, the distributor, but also those who develop communication strategies, what this role could be in order to approach the idea of the gendered object. Because as said at the beginning, this is not simply about saying gendered objects are bad in total, you know, that they should not be gendered objects. You know, as you saw from the research question from the UN, there is a virtue in considering a gendered approach to a particular research question. So it is not about saying there should not be gendered products in the design world, whether they're services, systems, or objects or commodities. But of course, when it comes to obvious financial inequalities, economic inequalities that weigh so heavily on an industrialized world, then you need to intervene in some form. But let me go back to the presentation, and you can see that I had something on the pink tax, not quite as eloquent as the way Shilam has done it, so thank you very much again. But there are a few details that come from, again, the United Nations. It's a text that was published by the United Nations Research Fund, Munich, in 2016, so it's a bit older, but it basically makes similar points to the ones that Shilam and Chen made. And you can see here also the way in which investigative reporters have revealed the huge price gaps that, as Chen says, you're not always conscious of when you walk into a store, and the lack of choice in a certain consumer culture, maybe not in central downtown New York, but in other places, makes it also very, very difficult to have these informed options about where to shop and what to shop. So if you want to buy Levi's, unfortunately, you are left with the only proposition that if you are a woman, you pay more for the same, exactly the same material product, you know? And this goes even further. Here's something that goes back a few years, 2014, where through consumer advocacy, namely somebody who noticed this through an online shopping, a consumer who basically named Rainey Posey, here's the write-up from a website called Moneywatch, who took Gap on in saying, why are plus-size jeans for women more expensive than plus-size jeans for men, you know? And the initial argument by Gap that more material would be used for plus size, of course, doesn't make any sense if plus size denim for men is cheaper, is the same as normal sized, if normal is the right word, as one of these different sizes. But when women go over a certain size, suddenly not only do they pay more because female jeans are more expensive than men, but also because plus size. So there is an element of double discrimination in body shaming coming into this, you know. And so she wrote a petition on change.org, and eventually, after a certain number of signature and exposure in the media, there was then a change of position by the manufacturer and by the brand Gap to acknowledge this, or Old Navy, as part of the Gap group. So maybe consumer advocacy does play a role, or not maybe, it does play a role, but as Chen also said, it is difficult to see how effective this is if it's case by case and not an umbrella law, you know, because on the back of this, of course, there was no change in law. Gap or Old Navy reacted, but it wasn't the fashion industry on a whole that suddenly got wise and said, oh yeah, sorry, we shouldn't charge you more, you know. So back maybe to the question, the relationship between the production of gender designs and their consumption. So where's the maker? What's the role of the maker? What's the role of the consumer? And I'll stay with fashion, and I'll do something that maybe is slightly controversial. But it is something that is quite noticeable in fashion, namely that the sexuality, I hesitate, I was just about to say sexual orientation, but that sounds like a 1950s term. The sexuality, the self-defined sexuality of the designer influencing the product. And I'm using fashion here for obvious reasons, because it is a commodity that is worn directly onto the body, and the physical appearance often is one of the first ways in which we see a demonstrative coding of gender or sexuality. And so I wanted to talk about fashion very briefly, two designers in the fashion world and their experience with discrimination, and then leaving this open, pairing this very polemically with a particular type of images. This gets even more polemical here. So you have a very male heterosexual photographer, Helmut Newton here, photographing what could be described maybe as a stylistic transfer of menswear into women's wear, which, as you know from the title, you know, Yves Saint Laurent, smoking, 1975, has become an iconic hallmark of Western fashion history. It's something that I'm sure if you've done fashion studies or you've done design history, it's one of these images that always comes up. And Helmut Newton wouldn't be the misogynist male photographer if he hadn't taken this a step further and went into something that approaches a kind of pornographic take on fashion photography, which unfortunately is very often to be found in maybe not as overtly as it was in the 1970s in Vogue, but you can still find a lot of these examples. Now, if we contrast something like this with an account, not directly by the designer, but very close to the designer, because the designer himself, Yves Saint Laurent, never spoke directly about this. His partner, his business partner and life partner, Pierre Berger, was very active in France for gay rights, especially during the AIDS crisis. And he was somebody who was very vocal about emancipation for gay people, lesbians and gay men. However, the designer himself, Yves Saint Laurent, was very reticent. The closest you get, and this is for those of you who are interested in fashion and sometimes want to research biographies of designer and try and go through the biography of a maker into the meaning of their designs. then here's a source that I can recommend, because good fashion writing, and I write on fashion, so I think I have a little bit of authority to talk about this, is very rare. It's very difficult to do. Here's one example where this has been done extremely well. It's a French journalist called Laurence Behin, and she wrote in 1993 a biography of Yves Saint Laurent with his collaboration and consent. And it is a very intimate picture of the creativity of a designer. And an early part of this, of the story, of the life story of Yves Saint Laurent, centers on one particular occasion and one particular situation that Behin, obviously through the conversations, many conversations he had with the designer, sees as crucial for the development of his creative work, his style, his approach to designing. And she says the following, quote, "The discovery of his homosexuality was something shameful. In Oran, Algeria, where Yves Saint Laurent was born, it left a deep scar. Yves Saint Laurent, then at the St. Louis Catholic Boys' School, was humiliated by his classmates because he was not like them. He experienced such reprobation already as a very young man due to his different way of behavior, of dress. This episode revealed an austerity within the timid man who, from then on, preferred to eclipse himself, to vanish as if confined to a submarine. And there was thus this emptiness, the abyss. The other ceased to exist. He was of no age anymore. This terrible experience revealed to him what was to be his world, to go as far as to lose himself, a destruction proper, and within this downfall, to regenerate himself through a love of the beautiful, of fashion design as a unique antidote." So the language is a bit florid, you know, and the translation, my translation from the French to the English doesn't really help in that case, the original French. I think there is an English translation now, or has come out a couple of years ago, so you can seek that out. And indeed, yeah, I think there's been a paperback now. But you can see that in this very evocative passage, a connection is drawn between the self-perception of the designer, also through his dress code that he wore in this Catholic boys' school, and the work that was to come later. Well, in Yves Saint Laurent's case, came very early because he started designing at 16. But the idea that there is something between the self-identification through a physical manifestation, the way in which you present yourself to the world, or in this case, how you withdraw from the world, and the creative design work that you produce from that. So this would be an indication between a particular coding of the designer, either through outside influences or through his own sensibility, and maybe a related coding of the creative output of the design work that comes out of his or her or their studio. And now, of course, as you know, Yves Saint Laurent has died, and the company has gone through many different stylistic changes. And it was quite curious to see that Yves Saint Laurent now, something that I'm not sure whether he would have necessarily condoned this, is making expensive labeled condoms in black latex, which seems to be one of their latest products. There's another designer, a women's wear designer, Jill Sander. The label still stands. She has retired from designing some time ago. And when she had a big exhibition in Europe that was traveling through France and Germany and the UK, there was an interview conducted in German, but then published by an English art magazine, Frieze magazine, in 2018, where the interviewer asks, "Little is shared publicly about your private life. The exhibition catalog quotes you as saying, 'Freely unfolding sensuality is more important to me than the classification of people into two genders.'" This is a very beautiful poetic statement that a lot of people would probably shorten to "I'm queer" or I don't see the world through a heteronormative lens. And the designer's response is, quote, perhaps stating those sorts of position creates new boundaries that I consider unnecessary. Freedom consists precisely in liberation from ambiguousness. Sorry, I'm stumbling over the words because it's also a very odd negation of a negation in one sentence. Freedom consists precisely in liberation from unambiguousness. So unambiguousness is something that is negative for Jill Sander, and you need to be liberated from this through the closing. So, which, if you reverse it, means you need to be ambiguous in the way in which you present yourself, but also clearly in the way in which she sees the design process. As a designer, I have always sought clothing that brings us sympathy as human beings and emphasizes our personalities rather than our sexual preferences, however varied they may be. And I'm citing this because when she gave that interview, she was over 70. And I think her long career in making clothes for women, but also for men later on, is a testimony to a particular approach that, for her age and for her position, I feel personally is quite liberal, is quite open, you know, to say this, that as a designer, you don't care about sexual preferences or personalities, you know, or you care about personalities, but you don't care about sexual preferences. And the binary, in a way, she is also opposing what the interviewer is suggesting, i.e. that she should come out and out herself as one thing, and that then that would put her work into a neat category. And it's very interesting that she resists this, because if you research her work over decades, and she started in the late 1960s working, so slightly later than Yves Saint Laurent, you will never ever find anything about her private life. And it was basically an open, not an open secret, because that's a weird, very weird way of putting it, but nobody was in any doubt that she preferred as her romantic partners women. There was no question about it, but it was not something that she would ever be drawn on, because people wanted to make an easy connection between, oh yeah, you're lesbian, so clearly you do manly fashion, right? You put women in, this was a photo from the catalog, you put women, I'll go one back and show you this photo again, put women in these kind of outfits, so clearly you must be lesbian, this must be a kind of form of articulating sexuality through your design work. And she very significantly resisted this all the time, you know. And she speaks of a design process that, although it is tailored to the body, and the body is obviously as a physiology coded through gender, you know, because you have different shapes, not necessarily binary as just men and women. You have many fluid shapes in between. Some of them organically, others come through exercise, come through surgery, and so on and so forth. But you have many different body shapes, obviously, that as a designer you have at your disposal that do not always correspond with the gender. And so for a designer of clothing that surrounds the body, this is obviously a very open challenge. And so you can see why a designer of fashion would be very consciously against binaries, because it allows for so much more freedom in the design process. But I would argue, if you see her response, that this is not just a creative reaction, but also something that in a small way is political. You know, she clearly makes a social case as well. So this was briefly about how does the self-identification of the designer relate to the product, and is this something that, if you're studying design, whether historically or contemporary, is this something that should be important when you look at design output? You know, should the gender or the sexuality of the designer matter? Is this a positive thing to assert and say, well, because they identify as this, their design work clearly has this push? socially, ethically, politically? Or should one say, no, the designer is a free spirit, a free soul, and yes, of course, their gender and their sexuality does play an influence or influence the design work, but it is not certainly a main consideration. I take the designed objects, systems or services as themselves and remove them from the person who's making them. So this is obviously an argument to make when you're studying it and when you're writing about design, or when you are also creatively working on design and looking at models and references for your own work. So let's talk briefly about materials, and then I come to the examples from my colleagues. Do materials matter in design? You know, is the cliched use of particular materials, colorations, surface designs, does that influence the way in which we categorize objects? You know, so here's a very polemical example. Male designer Ron Arad loves working with metal, and in this case with concrete. And is the idea of making, this is from 1983, a concrete stereo, does that identify where the designer's perception of this object comes from? Has it anything to do with the integration of the designed object, in this case, 2 speakers, an amplifier, and a turntable, into particular categories that makes it easy for the consumer to say, oh yes, these are, because of the materials that I used and the shapes that I used, they belong to this genre of design. So I, as a responsible consumer, or as an emotive consumer, I am either drawn to this or I consciously reject this, you know, as being too masculine, or in this case, because I would say these are quite masculine, or in this case, I'm attracted by the fact that they are raw and unfinished and slightly damaged and rough. And this is exactly how I want to identify with the objects in the home, you know, so that people who enter my own interior, they see those and they go, ah, yeah, this is the character that you want to project through your consumption of designed objects. So does the materials give you an indication? Or conversely, as in any creative process, can you, because certain materials, like for example, concrete, are associated with particular design practices? There was an article, I think, in the New York Times last Sunday on skyscrapers in Midtown Manhattan, built in the 1960s and 70s. And they were exclusively done in concrete and glass and steel. And they were all by male architects. And the proposition was that the male critic from the New York Times walked with a prominent female architect, Annabelle Seldorf, through these avenues that are now empty because of the restrictions in New York City, and trace a history of skyscraper design in New York. And you could see that the way in which a female architect, Annabelle Seldorf, who's a great fan of these things, you know, the way she reacted to it was very ambivalent, because on the one hand, she recognized in her own work how important these designers were, these architects who made these buildings, but at the same time, they spoke so much of a masculine discourse, and further that, of misogyny, because when there was a female designer involved, for example, in some of the storied designs by SOM architects, Scott Oren Merrill, that also did our Fifth Avenue building. When the lead architect was a woman, or a pair of a woman and a man, in the history books, only the male architect survives. And Annabelle Seldorf was at pain in arguing with the reporter that these glass temples, these steel temples, these concrete temples were actually also designed in part by women. And so there was an ambivalence in the way in which she celebrated the canonical architecture of white male architects in New York, and then tried to bring in, through particular design features, the role of women in there, you know. And she also moved between the idea of the architect being a woman, but also the occupants of a lot of these offices and buildings being women, and asking for particular features within the building. So it was the maker and the consumer in unison in her argument. But it was very ambiguous because it was trying to trace a material history of architecture, of design, through makers who were exclusively of one gender and were almost celebrated for these phallic, huge skyscraper structures that suddenly sprouted and were erected out of the ground in Midtown Manhattan. So a bit further on the idea of materials in design and whether gender does change the way in which an object is perceived. Here is something that the Swedish car manufacturer at that time still owned, partly by the Swedish government, but also by Swedish entrepreneurs and investors. Volvo, this goes back to 2004. The marquee, the brand still exists, but is now owned away from Sweden. I'm mentioning the idea of a Swedish car maker because Sweden, we talked about this before, the idea of legal impositions of making things equal. So if the consumers and the citizens of a society find it hard to affect equality, not inequality, that's easy, that happens every day because men rule the world, unfortunately, but equality, to affect equality is a very, very difficult thing for consumers to do, even if they're fully informed. So the idea that a government steps in and says, here are particular rules you have to follow. And Scandinavian countries, as you know, or Nordic countries, as they should be better called, Nordic countries have been at pains in saying we want absolute equality in our parliaments. So we have 50% women, 50% men. That's by law. The same with the boards of the board of governors or board of investors for one of the bigger companies. If you have over, I don't know what it is in Sweden, I think it's over 500 people, your board needs to be there needs to be a gender parity, 50%. I don't know how they deal with the idea of fluid gender now, but how that comes into the equation. But in 2004, Volvo took this image of progressive politics in Sweden into their own manufacture and said, we will, through this press release that you can see here, we will now build a car that is designed entirely by women. And you might as well ask, why? What was the idea behind it, apart from, if you want to be cynical, a marketing ploy? So there was a concept car that they started, and it's called Your Concept Car, YCC, and it was unveiled in the Geneva Auto Show in 2004. And so here is the team of the women who were responsible for the design. As you can see, it's a large group of 9 women who are responsible for everything from the engineering to the formal design of the chassis, to interior parts, to particular material choices when it came to recycled aspects of the car, replaceable, repairable aspects of the car. And I'll show you an interior of the car here. As I said, it's a concept car. It never went into full production. And when I put this on canvas and you have the opportunity to go back to it, I leave you to ponder whether this car of 2004, dated obviously slightly, because car design has moved on, but even in 2004, progressive, forward-looking, because it was a concept car, whether this particular interior speaks of the gender of their makers, of the female design team, the all-female design team, or whether it caters for the demands of a female clientele who are affluent and middle class and can afford a Volvo and want a car like this to be designed by an all-women design team for women consumers. And I leave this up to you, whether little details like the flowers on the side of the seat or the choice of materials and coloration reflects any of these considerations. Okay, let's go forward and hand over to Miguel, who had this example of cliches in coloring design.
Great, thank you. Can I share my screen somehow? I think you're muted now, sadly, but you have to stop sharing for me to share.
Mm-hmm. So I stopped sharing, so see whether you can go on. I went out of my screen, but I haven't stopped sharing. Let me see.
Yeah, no, now you're showing that quill.
I'm still sharing. Okay, hold on. There's my stop. I can't, unfortunately. And now that I've got, oh, I think I just had it. Stop share. Yep. Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry, Miguel. See whether you can present your slides now. Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
So, as Ulrich said, I'm going to talk about kind of a very cliche idea, but I think it's quite informative for design studies in many ways. So I'll just kind of go through a few slides and tell you all things you already know. Baby clothes, probably the most clear example of gender design to the point where it's cliche. Usually you have blue and pink baby clothes and baby blankets and baby toys. Blue generally considered or marketed for boys today. There's a lot to be said about this kind of how we got to this stage, and looking through all the sort of history of it, you can kind of begin to see all these many elements that we've been discussing that might be informative. So as some of you may know, it's rather a recent idea that baby clothing is gendered. Historically, at least here in the US, babies, regardless of gender, would just all wear white dresses for the first few years of their life, up until maybe 5 or 6 years old even. And here you can see a picture of the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, when he was young, at 2 years old, I think, wearing a traditional cotton white dress. And this relates to various things, even the idea of materiality, which we were just discussing, because as far as I could see, one of the reasons that babies would wear simple white dresses was because they were very easy to bleach. Cotton white dresses are very easy to clean, and things that aren't colored, you can just clean them very easily. So it was kind of a practical issue. As in the history of baby clothing, as things slowly changed, you begin to see that practicality gave way to certain other more complicated social ideas. During the past couple of centuries, developments in things like biology, psychology, psychoanalysis, and things like that brought up ideas of human development. And with development, people began to believe that people aren't simply what they are, but they are sort of what they become. And this led to a certain idea that you have to be careful how you dress your baby, because if you dress a baby in the incorrect gender, so I have a quote here that they said they might, dressing a baby in the wrong clothes might pervert them, right? They might grow perverted and there might cause some distractions. So you can begin to see how issues of materiality, which once dominated something like now considered a gender item, maybe previously ungendered, changed because of developments in science. Then by the mid-19th century, eventually this also changed a bit, and people, because of these ideas, started using more color in baby clothing. But as some of you may know, the original roles were reversed. Pink was considered a masculine color and blue a feminine color. And this is from a quote from something called Urshan's Infants Department. It said, the generally accepted rule is pink for boys and blue for the girl. Color is more suitable for the boy, while blue, which is more delicate and dainty, is prettier for the girl. So even in the, of course, the absurdity of characterizing colors in this way is evident. But you can even begin to see that the very language of the catalogs and things like this are gendered. And this kind of, if you sort of chart the development of baby clothing gendering, you begin with sort of what this white dress, which may be ungendered, and then you begin to have ideas of scientific development and psychology, and then advertisers come in. And then with advertisers, like in this example, you start to get a very complicated picture where things start to shift. Different advertisers began producing different lines of baby clothing, and they all try to characterize the things in this rigid way. Here is a chart from Time magazine that charts how in the 1920s, different producers and advertisers, retailers specifically, would label their different clothing. So in the same year, Filene's and Best's would say that pink was for boys, and then the opposite. And you can see it's kind of sort of broken down even, but the point being that the issue went from sort of material practicality to certain new scientific moral ideas, you might call it, and then it became a problem of advertising and production. So you can kind of see how fitting in with, well, my favorite part of this class, the issues are never really simple, right? Everything from gender design, it's not just about gender, it's about technology, it's about scientific developments, it's about, let's say, social morality or something like that. Eventually, of course, as we know, we sort of settled on the idea we have today, where blue is a boy's clothing and pink is generally a baby girl's clothing. And then we can sort of see how, with further developments in technology, the point at which gendering is applied to people became younger and younger and younger, to the point where now gender is sort of something that is produced and discussed even before birth, right? People get an image of the child, sex, and usually with that comes a gender, and they seem to be all the rage these days. I don't know if you've all seen these weird videos of people kind of exploding pink or blue smoke. So the only point that I think is not the only point, the main point that I think is interesting from these things is by looking at the history of product at the point of birth and even prenatally, right? Before you're born, you presumably have a baby room with pink or blue strawberries and, you know, pink or blue Kool-Aid and stuff. So the idea, I think, that this helps point out, and that is quite interesting for me, is that if you want to sort of turn things around, ultimately the product is the baby, right? Something like the gender reveal party or the baby clothing, what they point out is that what is ultimately fully produced is not simply something that is sold, but is the very gender identity of the child. And this always, although said in a different way, it always reminds me of Simone de Beauvoir, who has this nice quote that says, "One is not born, but becomes a woman," in a way. That quote rings true, but if you leave it kind of to this advertisers, one is already born having become a woman. Say the problem is so that it requires some kind of, if you will, a certain kind of intersectionality between issues like technology, production, consumption, of course, but even the ability of bleach or better cleaning chemicals. So I think the most cliche examples are sometimes perhaps the most informative, simply because we have so much history we can see behind them. So that's my little spiel. Thank you. Stop.
Thank you, Miguel. Yeah, not only do the cliches ring true and are most demonstrative, but also, as you just showed, if you take the cliche that everybody seems to know and unravel it by adding to design history or iconographic elements of art history or cultural history, if you add to it history of technology, social history, labor history, gender studies, media studies, then the picture becomes so much more complex. Not that it necessarily changes where the cliche comes from or how the cliche is shown, but it is something that the complexity of the different forces that interact to produce such a strong cliche. That is the interesting bit. So I think that's very nice to see. Thank you.
Just to add, the one thing this reminded me of also was in earlier in the class, I think I believe you were discussing critical theory and Hegel and things, and we were thinking about this idea of how we oftentimes, in terms of especially product design, were thought of as sort of a product being sold to a person who is this or that. But then you brought up the idea that we become, or we are what we consume, we are what we produce, right? And then this is already kind of bringing that down to the level of prenatally or something.
I mean, because gender is such a powerful determinant, whether rightly or wrongly. It is something that obviously now can be subject to discourses of genetic engineering and so on and so forth. So it goes very back. Let me go to this share screen again and then invite Aysegul to. So I have to skip a few slides and then go back. So my Anne is unfortunately, because of internet connection, she cannot join us. So I'll go forward to Aysegul. That was, and you see a few of the other contributions. You had the safety belt, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Do you have a presentation yourself, or are you happy to, if I flick through the slides that I put on and you talk over them?
Totally fine. Yes,
Perfect.
Totally fine. I don't have other slides.
So,
I'll just be talking.
Perfect.
Not as stable as I hope it would be. Is it okay? Can everybody hear me? Fine. Okay. All right. Great. Today I want to talk about the standard in design thinking, the norm, and how seemingly gender-neutral objects can in fact be quite gendered. I'll focus on, as you can see, on the seat belts and seat belts in cars and how they are interesting. I chose seat belts today because they are interesting to look at because they don't have the usual gendered attributions that we would see on the surface. At least on the surface, we don't see the usual gendered attributions such as the shape, the color, or the targeted consumer base, or anything like that. Seatbelts are for everyone, or at least that's what we think. They are regarded as the norm. If you're in a car, no matter who you are, you have to buckle up. But seatbelts weren't always the norm. Installing seatbelts in cars as a part of safety measures was only imposed in the 1960s. And the companies, since then, only made use of male crash the cars and safety seatbelts for safety. So what they did was they picked average-sized male dummies to see if the seatbelts work fine, if they provide safety to the driver and to the passengers in the car. And this was the case until very recently, until 2011. But why would they pick an average-sized male dummy? Do they expect only men will be riding cars? I mean, that might be one gendered expectation, right? That then the men will be driving, only men will be drivers, even, highly sexist context, that would be the expectation. But what about the passengers in the seats, passengers in, passenger seats? Women are not expected to be the passengers even, it's even in an extremely sexist division of labor, this is unexpected. So we all know that women are expected to ride in the cars, maybe not in the first seats, but in the other seats that are available. So then it seems like what the standard of safety really meant was the safety of an average-sized male. So an average-sized male represented the standard. So testing the car's safety with having one standard in mind, as you can imagine, has had consequences for the non-average male-sized people, which means at least half of the general population, if not more, because not every sized. This understanding of the standard resulted in women being killed and injured at disproportionately higher rates than males in car crashes. So this is a quote from the article by University of Virginia's Center for Applied Biomechanics found that seatbelted female drivers in actual car crashes had a 47% higher chance of serious injuries than belted male drivers in comparable collisions. For moderate injuries, that difference rose to 71%, end of quote. So 71%. And this is just one example. There are many other cases where the standard is perceived as the male, although when that standard represents at most the half of the population, and most of the time much less than that. So a closer look at an object that seems to be so gender neutral on the surface, a seatbelt that we are all expected to use, can reveal the hidden bias, the hidden mindset that produces and reproduces the gendered world we live in, and how it's constructed in each and every segment of life, which includes the design world. So I'd like to end with these questions, with a couple of questions. So what is the standard? Who decides or who gets to decide what the standard is? And what would it be like to design for the non-standard from a non-standard perspective? This discussion on standard and the norm is quite parallel with the discussions surrounding objectivity and subjectivity. Objective, non-biased perspective in research and in design is something that we all cherish, but if somebody else gets to decide what's the standard, and if that standard is not our standard, then how are we going to solve this problem? This reminded me of another larger question that was repeatedly brought up by second wave and third wave feminists, which is that what we have argued as objective all this time was in fact male subjectivity. So maybe there's something wrong with identifying the objective and the subjective, and maybe we should think about it from a different perspective. And yeah, I'd like to end this with this question that I already asked: what would it be like to design for the non-standard from a non-standard perspective? Yes, that's it.
Thank you, Aysegul. I think that was especially the ending, a very nice riposte to me pontificating about Hegel, and actually Miguel, my male colleague, seconding this, and saying, oh, it's about the object and the objective, and you very nicely shooting this down and saying, well, if it's only males who are making up this theory, what kind of objectivity is that? That's a subjectivity of one particular gender. So how do we know whether any of these theories do in fact apply to a diverse population, not just in terms of gender, but also race, cultural experience, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much for that. I think that these corrections are very, very necessary.
I jump in for a couple of links that I will put down there. So one of them is about pain treatments, and long story short, they usually use male subjects for different prescriptions, drugs, and then of course the results reflect their resilience. So many women had trouble to get enough subscription because they thought that it was just psychological, it was not bodily. And one interesting story that I found out very late is that people with red hair, natural red hair, are really they don't have higher tolerance to pain. So in one of the dentist union gathering or gala or night, whatever, all the male dentists, they complain about red hair women. Like, oh my God, they're so soft. Like even a little touch will make them go cry. And one of the male dentists, kind of the only true scientist in the room maybe, thinks that, okay, if this is all red hair women problem, maybe there is a certain scientific explanation for that. And it turns out, yes, it is true that they feel pain much more than any other people. So this kind of goes back to Aysegul's point. I couldn't find the link, but it was the ironic example. There's one medication for menstrual pain, and it turns out it only has been tested on men. So I leave you with that.
That is a fantastic segue into Bettine's project that she wanted to present. Maybe I can, Bettine, it's very late where you are now. So yes, you're nodding. Maybe I'll go backwards to the relevant images, and you can quickly tell us what inspired you. You provided this as a first instance, as a gendered objecthood in art and poetry and photography, and I added from my own volition, so I apologize for this, an article written by a female journalist on BuzzFeed about Rupi Kaur, and then you had a final image of one of your friends taking a cue from the diary of the writer and making her own visual diary. Do you have a presentation, or shall I go through the images and you tell me when to click on what?
Yeah, I think the connection is a little bad. I didn't hear everything properly that you said. Is that the same with everyone, or is it my connection?
I also have trouble sometimes, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry that I can check my internet connection. If you bear with me for 1 second, I would have to go out of the presentation.
But now it's all right. I can just start.
Let me just see.
You can go back to the Rupi Kaur image, the first one.
Okay, let me go back to share screen. Hold on. So I'm still in screen sharing mode, but I go to the presentation and I click to back. I'm sorry, I am on the connection that has worked the best in the past. But I'll hand over to Bettine, to talk about her case study, please.
Thank you. So what I wanted to present to you is my friend's art project, which is called Menstrugram. And I'm not sure if you've heard of this incident, but back in 2015, Instagram censored menstruation-related images posted by the artist Rupi Kaur, and you can see one of those images here right now. And there was a lot of protest against Instagram censoring these images, and many people said it was an attempt to invisibilize a central aspect of women's lives. And not partly in reaction to that, my friend started an art and political project called Menstrugram. So she created an Instagram account, and you can move to that slide now, Ulrich, on which she regularly posts abstract paintings that she has been creating with her own menstrual blood. So how that works is that she collects her menstrual blood in the so-called menstrual cup, and then she's painting actually in her toilet bowl with the blood, and it kind of creates these shapes in fusing with the water that is in that toilet bowl. And so she started it as an individual project, and then it became a collaborative project after a while, and she asked her followers to send her images, like abstract paintings made with their own menstrual blood, and that's what it is right now. And the reactions to her project were quite mixed. Some people thought it was a brilliant project for aesthetic and political reasons, and others said it was a disgusting project and rejected it. And it was interesting, though, that she doesn't only have the Instagram account, but also showed the paintings in galleries. And when she showed them in galleries, and people didn't know yet that they were created with menstrual blood, they actually liked the aesthetic of them. But once they heard that they were created with menstrual blood, they suddenly thought the paintings were disgusting. So the reaction to her artworks changed based on knowing what the material is, basically. So that's why I kind of chose this art project, because first of all, it's a reaction to a gendered censoring practice of Instagram's gendered censoring practice. And then it's an art practice that makes sense, makes use of a material that is produced in the female body, right? A man wouldn't have access to this material, or he would have to ask a woman to donate her menstrual blood to him. And then also the reaction to her artworks is gendered in that mostly it's also, or that's what she tells me at least, that it's more, the rejection comes from men in a higher proportion than from women. Yeah. That was it from my side.
So, thank you, Bettine. I very much like the bringing together of the aesthetic and the political, and also going back to what Aysegul was saying about the subjective and the objective, because a very famous collection of feminist rating in 1978 in the US very categorically stated the private is the political. And this has informed feminist discourse since then, certainly as a catchphrase. So can you talk briefly about where you see the connection between the aesthetic and the political in that the creation of the work and the reception? Where do you think the fault lines lie? When is something seen as aesthetic? Because you were talking about the reception. If people do not know the genesis of the artwork, then they see the aesthetic categories seem to say one thing, but then the feminist politics seem to generate a different reaction. Where do you see this divide between aesthetics and politics here?
I think it can even go both ways around, right? It can on the one hand be that you actually appreciate the aesthetics, but then you reject of the project because it's done with menstrual blood. But then you can also kind of stand behind the politics of the project, but not necessarily like the aesthetics of it, right? So I feel like when I looked at her followers, I saw that it's mostly women, and also many known feminists and feminist groups in Berlin. So it is not mainly because of artistic, but more so political reasons that they support her account. And I think that's also something my friend is struggling with, because she you know, she maybe doesn't really know herself if this is more yeah, I think the line is like blurred in a way, very brilliantly in her project. I like it a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I think ambivalence makes for the most productive artworks, because if the reception is not given, then the impact of the artwork is certainly heightened, because you leave more room for the beholder to exercise her imagination or his imagination. I think we have one more of my colleagues. Nate is here to talk about the choice that he was going to make. Because the images from Claudia of the female architect, I think Claudia cannot be here. So if
I'm here. I can't. Seems like you might have cut out though.
Okay. Yes, I'm afraid the internet doesn't seem to work that well on my side. So I think I lost you completely. So I apologize for that. I think I zoomed out, if that's the right expression. I wanted, before I hand over to general discussion. One more project or one more example from Nate.
Sorry, I can't hear you too well.
I'll try and increase my volume, but I fear it's nothing to do with my microphone. I think it is the internet connection. So I apologize. Is it better now?
I can jump in.
It's a little better. Yeah, it's a little better.
Shall we try, Nate, and see whether I can just hand over to you and show the images and you can talk over them?
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
Can you see them, Nate? Can you see on the screen share?
I cannot see anything.
The shared screen doesn't work? Because it appears on... I'm very sorry. It appears on my computer, so I can see that I'm sharing a screen.
Okay.
So maybe while I zoomed out, while my internet connection was severed, it didn't share. Let me try and go in and out again. Can you see us now?
Oh, yeah, I can see it now.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I can't see anything on the screen, but oh, there we go. Yeah.
So I apologize. So it's clearly very bad, my connection. But since we can see...
want me to go ahead then?
Please, yeah, do.
Oh. Okay, yeah. So I'll make this brief, I suppose. This is a relatively old article, but as somebody who's worked in menswear and fashion for some time and design, both on design and marketing side of things, I thought this was just an interesting article that came up in my recitation class the other day, and just an interesting example of kind of how objects are again marketed in a gendered way, or how gender is a factor in marketing. And so this is oftentimes this article goes over, and it's pretty easy to spot this phenomenon once you read it, is that stretch synthetics in men's jeans and men's denim is relatively recent kind of proliferation, I suppose, within the last kind of like 5 to maybe 10 years max, but I'd say more like 5. And it's because their softness and kind of the comfort in denim specifically is associated with femininity, and 100% cotton, tough, rigid jeans are so often associated with this kind of quintessential American manliness. And so it's very difficult to market comfortable jeans to men. If they're kind of labeled as something that's comfortable. The irony, of course, being that men actually really do want comfortable jeans. They just won't buy it if it says that it's comfortable or that it's stretchy. And so you find a lot of companies kind of evoking motion and activity and speed, and kind of this almost like functional, almost like tactical quality to these things. And so you see renamed as rapid movement, or as active, or as hyperflex is one of my favorites. So these kind of really rigorous, intense, kind of quintessentially, I guess you could say quintessentially masculine, or kind of movement heavy ways to market these fabrics, and that is how they're able to sell. And so men will buy these clothing and not even really necessarily realizing that this article goes into it, that they're 90% lycra or 50% lycra. But they're instead something they can use for movement, and for kind of fulfilling a physical objective. So it's quite interesting to see the language around these things change, for something that is actually that actually a lot of these men actually do desire, because in some of these interviews they talk about how they're their favorite denim, that they love these 50% stretch jeans. And obviously stretch denim has all kinds of environmental implications, but it's definitely quite interesting to see that it's as kind of welcomed by men, but it just required a name change essentially. So that's kind of a quick way to sum that up. But Yeah, or I don't know if I can hear you if you're speaking or not.
I'm just trying to find the best spot for my internet connection because it seems to be, yeah, unfortunately, I get a signal that says it's unstable. What I wanted to do is to hand over for a general discussion anyway, because I think my connection allows me, maybe this is symbolic, it's easier for me to listen than to speak. But I wanted to quickly show you when I'm posting the presentation on Canvas for you to see what else it contains. So if you want to go back to this for your research, please do so. So very quickly, before we open it up for a general discussion, I wanted to show you a number of links to language. Here's a project by an ex-RCA student, Royal College of Art in London, on gender-based language in designing. So you can go onto the website, you can type a particular word, and there will be a moving graph that tells you whether these words in the design field are seen as masculine or feminine. So it's quite a nice exercise to go through. Then there's an early language experiment, which goes actually back to 1929. And this is a little test for you. Which of these shapes is Buba and which is Kiki? So this is something for you to work out and to test yourself. And then you can go through the theoretical apparatus that stands behind it. And
oh, he's back.
He's back.
Yes, he is back. I'm sorry. It is really bad. As I said, this probably tells me that I should keep quiet now. The final, is the screen still shared? The final set of screens that I wanted to share is a kind of nostalgic look at what only a few years ago in 2011, American advertisers thought was acceptable in terms of advertising in language, namely a move by a soft drink company to market a particular beverage as not being for women. And then the hilarious social media impact that this has, where they launched the 10 Mandments, i.e. I won't even say a humorous, this is not humorous, a play on the 10 Commandments, and then the kind of Facebook reaction back in 2012 that you can read up on if you feel so inclined in the presentation, and then to see what Dr. Pepper does now. Namely, in its Dr. Pepper diet ads, you could see that their masculinity is presented in a very different way, you know? And again, it's this idea of who is marketing to whom here, you know? But just to see historically where Dr. Pepper in 2011 was and where they are now. And to end just on a few visual examples of further books that you can use for your research. But, so this would be the presentation. But if, for those of you who can stick around for a bit, I would invite you to join a short discussion of how you feel the role as a researching design and creatively exercising design makes you feel set up if you wanted to tackle these problems of inequality, of gender design, either in a positive fashion that you say, yes, design needs to be gendered for those and those reasons, or to say, no, designs should not be gendered, but should be gender neutral for those and those reasons. So I would be very, very interested in hearing your opinions.
Hello? Can you hear me? All right, so I really have interesting thoughts on I really think this topic is very, very interesting on the gender equality on the design studies. And I think I think from a positive side, I have seen a growing trend about like there are more, more female designers are coming in the industry, especially in the tech field. And I have been attending, a different design conference in the past 2 years, and like I really saw like there are more and more female designer speaker are talking about their work and talking about how they contribute into the technology world, like from different other companies. So I really saw like a growing trend, like there are more female designers are coming in to get more involved with technology and design. And the other thing I also want to mention, from the educational standpoint, there are also more university offer a special scholarship for female students who are majoring STEM major, like mathematics or engineering and computer science. And my undergraduate school, RPI, they have a program specifically. They also have, fraternity and a club, like open to female engineers only. And they also have scholarship that offer to female engineering students only. And I think that's really a good thing that encourage more female students come into this field, and that can bring a really good balance. Because my undergrad design professor told me, if you go back to the design textbook, and you'll see a lot of, renowned graphic designer, they are male, and you hardly will see a female graphic designer in the textbook. Besides, I would say Paula Search. And but like in the past, I would say 10 years, like the trend is really changing. I think there are more female are getting involved in the in the design process. But I think another thing I want to just add to on, but I think this also divided by different culture. I think America, especially in city like New York and or states like California, is more diverse. And but if you go to the Asian market, like if you go to China or Japan, I think the gender stereotype might still exist, especially when I was if you go to like any Chinese tech company like Tencent or Alibaba, and if you go into their manager part, you'll see indeed there are a lot of female designers, but for the design manager, is still the male are still taking a large portion of it. So I think it's also based on different culture, might China country like China, they need still take a little bit time to keep up with the growing trend. So that's my reflections on this.
I would also say, if I may, that art and design is one thing that's it's sort of an interesting sort of avenue to have this discussion, because it's almost like cooking, to use a counterexample, cooking, where, at home on that sort of level, the women are supposed to, expected to do the cooking. But on that higher level, you look at chefs and you look at that industry, and, the majority of these gourmet chefs are men. And so I would say, it's almost like once you've reached that certain level, it's like, okay, now, step back, let the men kind of handle it, which is, kind of interesting, because it also speaks to that sort of balance between fine art and craft that we sort of get into when we're talking about design. I know, for example, a huge trend in the past several years has been embroidery, and the adoption of embroidery as a fine art practice, as opposed to a sort of craft that's, again, often thought of as women's work. And it's really interesting, because there are sort of the social transgressions that still exist in the design world. I mean, like, for example, going to the hardware store, or like even at my job at the art supply store, you've got people who are saying, like, are you sure that's what you're looking for? Or are you sure? Like, like, oh, like, what are you working on? Maybe and it's like, okay, I can handle it. And at the same time, right, it's still a balance, because it feels like a disservice to say that, my gender, my sexuality plays no role in the work that I create. So it's like you were saying, a very complicated issue.
If I can interject, maybe, I think, like, coming from someone who's non-binary, I think it's a very worthy discussion to be had. I suppose from my perspective, I think gender is a construct, something that is a construct that can be used productively and can also be used in a harmful way. So as designers, we need to consider our own preconceptions that may have come from being raised in like a cis heteronormative society, and see like what we should take and what we should abandon in our own creative practices.
Thank you. I think that's a very fundamental observation that we need to make here. I remember 2 semesters ago at the International Women's Day, we had a public lecture on female participation in the design world. And it was very importantly put forward, not just that you had a male tutor presenting, which was completely felt out of tune and disrespectful, but also there was this idea of gender binary as a category established structurally at the beginning, and that coded everything we were doing. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind. Yes, thank you very much. Other contributions, other opinions about this, about the discussion?
I think I can add one last thing about an example. It's the quarantine time, so we have a lot of time to go to the internet and check stuff, and also it's good and timely information to learn about history and how we construct gender. So apparently, since ancient times, there's a specific bacteria that causes urinating blood for men. And it's mostly in agricultural places where there are dams, etc. So first it appears, historical records appear in ancient Egypt. And at that time, they think that women have monthly menstruation and men has once in a while. So they don't really think that menstruation is something that is gendered. I don't want to make jump conclusions, but it's one of the rare civilizations, ancient civilizations, that we see women leadership, we see female goddesses, we see women in power. And I don't know if it plays a role, but maybe just imagining for men, imagining having menstruation once a month, not going through it, just imagining it would be even a little helpful to consider other experiences. So that's one thing. And the other thing, we have a huge problem with design and art fields in general. And Emma, the professor who used to teach this class years before, she was working on how design and fine art as institutions, they were founded by men. And at that time, especially 18th and 19th century, most of the design products like quilting or knitting or sewing was not viewed as design at all. It was just like women do, so they have to do it. The idea was like, it's a necessity. It's not extra like art that we actually put in separate position or even higher position. So it's funny because now we're going back to that trend, and still, like Robin says, many men of higher positions, they take credit of all those historical progress that women made for centuries. I'm not saying only women made those quits, but overall, the historical accumulation of patterns, of techniques is co-opted by a few men, is being co-opted by a few men right now. And it feels unjust.
Thank you, John. Yes, certainly. I think there's a widespread pattern, especially for white male heterosexuals in an industrialized world, to look what other people around them produce and then take ownership of that by making it into a profession. Yes, that is, if you're in charge of the discourse, it's a very easy thing for you to do, you know, that you can just say, okay, I now decree this as Robin's saying, craft, this is design. And if it suddenly becomes commercially viable, then I can appropriate it for my own ends, you know. And I think this happens with the tradition of medicine, for example, you know, which was a woman's domain, and then across civilization moved into male domain, you know, when suddenly, when it started to become something that was reputable in a society and didn't involve witchcraft or magic, but was suddenly something that was scientifically rational and money could be made, and then suddenly became an interesting profession. So that is certainly historically not something that you can observe. Okay, I don't know whether there are any more questions, but I don't want to have the last words or sum something up, but what I liked was that there seemed to be a suggestion that the idea of subjectivity is very important for any creative process, including design. And the subjectivity often comes from the very body that produces the design, if it's a collective, from the collective body that produces the design. And that this element of subjectivity should not be underplayed, you know, and it's very, very important. And to retain this and to retain distinction through bodily, mentally, subjectivity is something that brings objects into particular categories. The way in which we formulate these categories and talk about them and evaluate them in hierarchies, that I think is a crucial thing, so that we don't devalue certain things and value other things higher than others, you know, but apply a certain equity to sensibility and subjectivity that informs design decisions. And then we can say, okay, hold on, why is one set economically or culturally at a higher level than another? How come? And then you can start questioning this. But the actual process of the maker, that is something that if you could reduce it to a certain subjective impulse, to the will to art, then that is something that needs to be retained. The context in which this is done, of course, plays an important role, and it's hard to often disentangle the two things, you know, what comes out of the personal maker, what comes out of her context or their context. But this idea of the impulse, of the creative impulse, is certainly something that codifies design in a positive way, and that needs to be analyzed as well. But the harmful codifications, alienations, and estrangement that happens through culture and society and economics that bear down on the creative design, that is something clearly where we have to apply a very critical angle. So, thank you very much for your stamina, for those of you who stayed with us. I'll put the recording on the Canvas site and also the slideshow. And for those of you who find that topic interesting for further development, please feel free to have a look. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. And see you next week. Bye-bye.